Apple is in talks to buy long-term supplies of cobalt directly from miners for the first time ever, according to Bloomberg reports. The move seeks to ensure that Apple will have enough of the key battery ingredient. This comes at a time, of course, when the electric vehicle boom is expected to fuel a shortage of the battery mineral. Sources indicate that Apple is eyeing contracts to secure several thousand metric tons of cobalt a year for 5 years or even longer. Apple, however, has declined to comment on this particular story. Jack Farchi of Bloomberg News joins us now to discuss this story and to understand what the rationale really is. Jack, thanks so much for joining us. I want to start off by asking you what the rationale is behind Apple's move to directly acquire cobalt from miners, and also if you could explain to us how the cobalt mining industry works now and how the supply chain works currently.
Thanks very much for having me. So at the moment, it's a very complicated supply chain where miners, many of them in Congo produces maybe 2/3 of the world's cobalt at the moment, will sell on to sometimes middlemen, then to refiners, then to companies that produce the raw materials to go into battery making, then finally onto battery makers, and those are the ones who will then sell to Apple or to Apple suppliers, which put all the batteries into the iPhones. What we're reporting now is that Apple is looking at going directly to the miners to buy cobalt. Probably that doesn't mean that Apple's going to be doing anything enormously different in terms of the rest of the supply chain, but what it is a sign of is that the cobalt market is looking very interesting. The electric vehicle boom and really the change in expectations for electric vehicles that has come about over the past year or so, with huge automakers from Volkswagen to BMW to Ford and Tesla all suddenly saying they're going to electrify their vehicle fleets over the next 5 to 10 years. Suddenly people are looking at that and saying, what do these batteries for electric vehicles require? They require cobalt and other metals. Is there going to be enough cobalt? We're not sure. And the price of cobalt has tripled, therefore, in the last 18 months. But also you have other users, people like Apple, who, smartphones are now a quarter of the global cobalt demand, the single largest consumer of cobalt, and a company like Apple looking at it and perhaps saying, can we be sure that we're going to have enough cobalt in the next 5 to 10 years as potentially electric vehicles take off? One way to ensure that you do is to go directly to the miners and say, okay, we'd like to buy the cobalt from you.
Saying that you were talking about the price of the battery metal has actually, how it's tripled in the past 18 months. And, I was hoping to pull up the particular graph and statistic from the Bloomberg terminal as well. But it's not just that. It's also, the sort of demand that's expected for something like this. When it comes to cobalt use in batteries, we expect it to really jump up. We've seen the jump from 2016 to 17 to 2020, then what's projected for 2025, and then it touches 300,000 tons in 2030, based on some of the estimates in your story. And what's even more interesting is that while we're talking about this electric vehicle push, even here in India, we're talking about an electric vehicle push in the year, by the time we hit the 2030 target. And of course, there's this massive push in China, of course, for electric vehicles as well. We've seen rising demand out there as well. But when it comes to the use of cobalt in electric batteries and lithium-ion batteries, it's a very different application, isn't it, when it comes to the amount required for perhaps, a lithium-ion battery in an iPhone and, of course, in an electric vehicle. So would you say this is a very sound business move by Apple, really preempting, what the entire scenario will be like in the coming years?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Apple produces, or sells rather, many thousands and millions of phones, but each one only has maybe 8 grams, 10 grams of cobalt in it. Just, to have a sense of how much that is, that's probably worth about $1 at today's prices, and that's even after prices tripled. So for Apple, commercially at least, the price of cobalt is almost a rounding error. It could rise many times and it wouldn't have a huge impact on Apple. For the electric vehicle industry, on the other hand, it's a very different question because they use much more cobalt. The value of the cobalt in an average electric vehicle is maybe $500, $1,000, $1,500, depending on the exact chemistry of the battery. So for them, a big increase in the price of cobalt could be a significant problem. And that's one reason why I think you'll see, as we move through the next 5 to 10, 15 years, probably by 2030, as you were talking about, car makers and battery makers having invested a lot of money in research and development to try and reduce the amount of cobalt in their batteries, or even to use battery technologies that don't involve any cobalt at all, because everyone can see that there is a supply issue around cobalt. If the whole world is going to suddenly start driving Teslas, there isn't enough cobalt on the current chemistry of a Tesla battery. So that's why we probably need to move, if the world is going to move to electric vehicles, and the electric vehicle boom is really going to take off as people are beginning to anticipate at the moment, probably the industry will need to move to a battery that uses less cobalt or even no cobalt.
Right, Jack, another very interesting aspect of your story is the fact that Apple is not only taking on its original rival Samsung in this race to really acquire cobalt, but there's also top car manufacturers, of course, since you're talking about the EV push, who have also secured several cobalt mining deals, be it, or some of those deals are currently being negotiated, be it BMW or even the likes of Volkswagen and BMW and Volkswagen, and also other European manufacturers as well.
Yeah, we're at this fascinating moment for the market where everyone is looking at the numbers that you've mentioned, seeing cobalt demand from electric vehicle batteries tripling, global cobalt demand tripling or even more in the next 10 or 15 years, looking at the supply side and seeing it all, a lot of it comes from Congo, and there aren't a lot of obvious new sources of supply, so everyone can see the same story. At the same time, right now, there isn't a cobalt shortage. There's plenty of cobalt around, and in fact, a couple of the biggest miners, Glencore and Eurasian Resources Group, are about to very drastically increase supply. So there is supply available, which creates this very interesting moment in the market where all of the big consumers want to buy up supply because they see that possibly there will be a shortage at some point in the future, while at the same time the producers have supply to sell them. So it's a really interesting market. There haven't been any deals yet of any significant scale, but we're expecting probably in the next few months to start to see some of these big long-term deals be signed.
Right, you know, especially, Jack, when it comes to Apple and its supply chain in Congo, there have been issues earlier. There were concerns when it comes to child labor and, of course, also human rights violations that were taking place in that particular region. And I think Apple, at one point last year, reassessed some of these contracts and from whom they would actually be procuring it from as well. Do you think are those things that will actually be taken into consideration, considering now if they're actually considering purchasing cobalt directly from these miners?
I think Apple is very concerned about the source of their cobalt supplies, because they've come under a lot of criticism. They and other technology companies have come under a lot of criticism, really, for not knowing exactly the source of their cobalt supplies, and maybe 10–15% of the global cobalt production comes from these small-scale artisanal mines, as they're called, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there aren't very much in the way of safety standards. Sometimes the people doing the mining are children, and human rights groups, particularly Amnesty International, have been very critical of the cobalt industry, including the end consumers like Apple, for not knowing whether they're using this this cobalt in their supply chains. As a result of that, Apple has been very active, and it's published a list last year for the first time of all of the companies that supply it cobalt. It said it wouldn't allow into its supply chain any cobalt from artisanal Congolese production. I don't see this move that we're reporting today as directly related to that, but of course, if Apple can go and secure a long-term contract for cobalt from a big miner, then they have a very easy answer to the question, are you buying any cobalt from artisanal Congolese production? They can say no, because we know exactly where it's coming from, because we signed the deal ourselves.
Right, Jack, really appreciate you joining us on the show today. And for those of you watching, well, Apple is perhaps in talks to buy cobalt directly from miners. Thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned to Bloomberg Quint.